You're listening to The Big Lift, the podcast of Web Trends Optimize, the CRO solution that enables marketers and developers to maximize the ROI on their digital properties. Web Trends Optimize is a powerful, feature-rich and easy-to-use solution, all delivered within a fixed-price contract with no additional cost for increased functionality ever. During these podcasts, we meet some of the key influencers within the marketing and conversion world to understand their roles and examine their challenges. One of the most common areas we discuss with our clients is around using CRO to optimize forms. This is particularly important as forms are often the start of the conversion process, but all too often, they're also the place where visitors abandon their journeys. So today, I'm joined by Alun Lucas, Managing Director of Zuko, a form analytics tracking and optimization provider, to discuss the advantages and pitfalls of form design. Alun, who suffers the most from bad forms? Is it particular markets or company size?
Well, I mean, technically, I think you can find bad forms in any area, but what we tend to find, just to flip the question slightly, those that can benefit the most from form optimization and improving their forms, they tend to fall into one of three pots or a combination of them. The most common one is if they have complex forms. So if you're asking more questions or difficult questions, then it's more likely that you're going to mess things up and have a bad form and a bad design that puts people off. Categories 2 and 3 are kind of related. So first one is a high cost of customer acquisition. So obviously if you're paying a lot to get your customers, if you have bad form design, it affects you more disproportionately. And then the third piece is customer lifetime value. So if you have a high customer lifetime value, obviously, if you can improve your form from bad to good, then you're going to see a bigger return. Now, in terms of the question around, okay, who suffers most of it, is say typically when you're looking at bad design, it probably is the more complex forms that tend to have bad design. As I say, anyone can have bad error messages or bad validation. And we see that often, and for us, we see a lot of forms and we do a lot of work in financial services sector because they do have complex forms and they have forms that are necessarily somewhat complex because they have regulatory requirements. However, they tend to make it more difficult for themselves. They will overcomplicate things over and above what they need to do, or they'll structure a form that's very difficult for the user to make their way through and to pass, and a thousand other errors that we see that cause bad user experiences and bad user forms, if that makes sense.
So presumably it's more B2C rather than B2B, although I do know that B2B companies use forms as well. Would you say it's predominantly B2C?
Certainly, yes, we see that a lot more because the forms tend to be complex and not exclusively, particularly in financial services. Often what you'll see in B2B is it's kind of a lead generation, lead capture. Mm-hmm. So you're just looking to capture someone's contact details so you can follow them up with a direct sales. So we still see this done badly on a number of occasions, asking for things that are unnecessary, problems with the validation or refusing to accept email addresses if they're a Gmail account and things like that, which basically hurt the user experience and hurt conversion. But overall, yes, B2C, purely often because of the sheer volume that you see going through a form, we see companies who have more issues in the B2C space.
You mentioned the word complex forms, and that can be complex, could be, 10 fields, or it could be 50 fields in some financial institutions and things like that. Is there an optimal length of form?
It's an interesting question, and that's kind of one that's often a little controversial. I suppose in general, you would have the principle that if you don't need to ask something, don't ask it, because there's obviously always is a chance that someone will be put off by it. However, having said that, length of form isn't necessarily the determinant of conversion rates. And I'll give you an example. So we have a lot of benchmarking data at Zuko because we see a lot of forms. Mm-hmm. And what we see is actually the sector with the highest conversion rate is local government. And they are also the sector which have the longest forms. So you're seeing, extremely high completion rates, but extremely long forms, which, if you were to take the fact that long is bad, you would say, what's going on here? So there are other factors at play that are more important than the length of form. In this particular case, for local government, it tends to be because they have a monopoly on services. So where are you going to go to get the same service? And so people are very motivated to complete the form. So motivation trumps length in that case.
That's really intriguing that that you can think that the local council has the highest conversion rates.
Yes.
When you think that, in my experience, local councils have some of the poorest website designs around. They're functional rather than customer journey centric, although it is getting better, I have to say. So it does surprise me, but that monopolistic area, obviously people want to get something and they're not going to be able to get it somewhere else, so they have to trudge through the form often.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And also sort of another example from a different angle, you sometimes see it with forms. If you cut them down too much, your conversion rate goes down. So if someone's expecting to, I'll use an example, they apply for a mortgage or another financial product, and you asking 3 or 4 questions, sometimes it's like, actually, you'll see that people are expecting to provide more. So actually, if you look too bare, then actually conversion rates can go down, and there are a few studies that have shown this as well. So again, it's not necessarily about the length; it's about what's right. So yes, the general principle is if you don't need to ask something now, don't ask it, but be cognizant of all the other factors at play that will affect your conversion rate, and don't get too hung up on trying to cut your form down to 3 fields if realistically it needs to be longer.
One of the bugbears that I've got, and this is a personal bugbear, it doesn't represent the views of our company, is that forms have now taken the place of human interaction. And therefore, when you get stuck in a form because the question may be ambiguous, it's very difficult to be able to overcome what you're expecting to put into that field. Do you find that's part of it, is that people are trying to be able to reduce overheads by having forms as opposed to humans?
I think it's a fair point. I think it's probably putting that in a broader business context of customer support, trying to make everything digital. I think it's not necessarily forms. The form itself is always going to require information. If you need to fill out a form, again, I'm going to use the mortgage application, you're going to need to provide that information. And the fact that you don't do it now in person, your bank manager is it's not necessarily the forms issue. It's just it's a broader business issue of cost cutting. But interestingly enough, we have sort of clients in India where we look at their forms, and there's certainly a different dynamic at play there, because the user rarely fills out the form. Often
Right.
what happens is the agent fills out the form. It could be face to face, but usually on a phone. So they'll be speaking to the customer and asking the questions and then tapping in that themselves. So actually you can see that different markets have different solutions to it. Obviously in the West, often it is about cutting the costs rather than having that customer service, if that makes sense.
Is there a way of interrupting the form filling to be able to provide more information? So, say, for instance, you've got a particular question that says, please provide the last 3 addresses that you lived at over the last 12 years, or whatever it might be, some ambiguous thing like that. If you were to put in, say, a tooltip or a help button or something like that, does that decrease the conversion rate?
No, typically a lot of friction in forms is around that error messaging and the instructional copy, giving people tips on how to do it, making sure it's clear what they should be doing. And using your very specific example, it's an interesting one because that is one of the questions we see often drives abandonment, which is give me your last 3 addresses or your addresses over the last 3 years, because if they've moved in different places, they often can't remember their addresses. They've got to go back. They've got to try and find it. So it's often an issue. And we often say to our clients to say, okay, well, even a tip like have a look on your Amazon account, because actually, if you want to find your history, Amazon knows a lot more about your history than you can probably remember.
That's a really good idea, actually.
If you go in there, you'll see all your old addresses, unless you've purposely deleted them.
Mm-hmm.
So actually, that's just an individual tip for that. But in terms of your general point, yes, giving tips, giving advice is crucial. particularly in complex forms. Again, go back to the mortgage example. If you're asking for someone's gross income, what does that mean? You're assuming that people know what it means. They generally won't do that. Particularly if you're asking for their assets or their wealth, what do you mean then? And it's absolutely critical in having a tip which tells them essentially what they need to look for and what they need to enter.
We've talked a bit about complex forms, and I'm sure we'll revisit that. But there's always been an adage in marketing is to keep it simple. So in the first interaction with your potential visitor, you're looking for perhaps just an email address and a first name and last name. So is there a kind of, I suppose, a template that says how many questions you should put in? And is there ever a situation where there are too many questions? And what do you do as an organisation to be able to reduce that?
I'll caveat this by saying every form is different and it depends on your objective.
Mm-hmm.
And I kind of link it back to what I was talking about before with local government. What do you need to achieve, to add? So there's no right answer. But for example, if you're just looking to get someone's name and email, just ask for their name and email. If you don't need things like their organisation, etc. So I think if you're looking for longer stuff, it's probably a specific audit within your company, because one of the tensions we often see with form design and form optimization is the competing interests within a business. So the conversion person might want it to be kept simple. However, the marketing person wants as much information as possible so they can remarket to the potential customer.
Or vice versa.
Yeah, exactly. So you have those tensions at play. You need to audit. What do you need to ask now? What are your processes? So what can you ask later? So if you're asking for someone's occupation or whatever it may be, do you need to ask it now? Can you capture the information, push them along the sales or lead pathway, and then ask them later on the pertinent question? So again, if you very simple example, I'm taking it back to mortgages because I think it's in my head today, but you can do the lead capture to start with. You then could have an advisor if there's a broker involved to talk to the person, find out the information later once you've established that boundaries of trust. Because as you know, if you went up to someone in the street and then just started suddenly saying phone number or occupation, someone will go, what are you talking about? Yeah, so you can kind of do that, and you can do that within the form itself. General principle not always held, but general principle is to start with the easy and move to the more difficult. So you're building the relationship. The people are just giving you their name to start with, which is why forms start with name typically. Give you a little more information, and then you start to ask the more difficult questions when they're involved and invested in the form. And so it could be within the form, or it could be potentially as part of a broader process. Once you do have their details, you've got your either via email or by phone or however to build up the rest of the information that might be useful to your organisation, but it's not critical to capture it at the first stage.
So at what point of the visitor's journey should you start collecting data? Because to be presented with a large form, and again, thinking more financial terms, you're obviously at a particular point in, yes, I want to apply for a mortgage or a loan or whatever it might be. But there are certain elements as you go through a customer journey or a visitor journey where you could perhaps start collecting data such as, what's your first name? So we can respond to you if we're looking for things as Fred or Bill or whatever it might be. Collecting information across multiple touch points as opposed to getting a full form all at one blast. Does that work?
We've seen it work quite well. So taking the form as its own entity, let's say you have the final form which converts someone to become a customer, an e-commerce checkout or whatever it may be. So let's take that example. Again, data privacy varies in different jurisdictions. So obviously that has to be your first concern. But we have seen in certain places where you are able to capture that information through, for instance, people asking for more information, filling out a smaller form, and then bringing it, pre-populating later on. You can see that if you can always pre-populate or do calculations for the user, it saves time. We've all had those frustrating forms where you get asked questions, you move on, and you kind of get asked the same questions or things that billing address and is one of those classic, delivery and billing addresses when you're getting asked to enter it twice. Well,
Yeah.
actually, you can pre-populate or have a button to pre-populate because 90% of the time it's the same thing. You can do that. So certainly, data privacy notwithstanding, we have seen where you can do that. Conversion rates do improve, and that's why things like the autofill in your browser kind of works quite well as well. People do use it because it saves them time on common address fields that they don't have to type their address out every time. Usually, we do see forms which don't allow it, which does cause some friction.
So why do you think that businesses still have forms that customers struggle with?
I think the fundamental issue is the lack of attention paid to the form. I think we struggle because forms online have come from forms offline.
Mm-hmm.
If you remember, I'm certainly old enough to remember having to fill out a big old printed form and put it in the post.
Yeah, me too.
And I think kind of the way it started was let's just replicate that online. And so people say, it's a form. How bad can it be? And they put it on there, and it's not sexy to marketing departments or the rest of the business as other things. They're spending millions driving people with advertising campaigns to the site, or they're spending a lot of money on web design to make the site look cool and flashy and on brand.
Mm-hmm.
But the actual sharp end of it is just like, well, okay, it's not that interesting. It's a bit geeky. So it takes a certain type of person or organisation to really care about that sort of thing, because, as I say, it doesn't seem that sexy. Now, I think things are changing with cultures of experimentation and optimization growing, but I think it kind of all derives from that indifference to the importance of the form. People don't realise how important it is. And in your day job, if you're the marketing director, it's just not that interesting. It's a small, data-driven, unsexy thing.
One of the frustrations, my daughter is selling her flat at the moment, and one of the challenges we've got is everybody seems to be sending what you would describe as a PDF or an Adobe document,
Mm-hmm.
which myself I find very frustrating. If you've got, say, for instance, I have a part ownership in the flat, and so we're having to fill out a physical document twice.
Yeah.
Because I live in Berkshire and she lives in the West Midlands. So it's challenging to be able to do these sorts of things. Do you think that companies see Adobe Docs type of things, PDFs, as kind of an easier, quicker way of being able to generate forms? And do you see that they have their own challenges?
Yeah, I think they do think it. The reason they do send that is they're easier. You're potentially getting this from businesses who are less sophisticated. If you want to build a web form, although there are products out there to do it yourself, it requires effort. And if you're not that savvy, it's potentially easier to send a PDF, because
Mm-hmm.
that's a physical representation of a classical form, although obviously you can get ones now that you can fill in. So I think that they are much more user-friendly. If you set it up so it has a box so you can type in, each one becomes like an online form almost. But often what you'll be dealing with is if you're looking at estate agents or certain banks, it's just, okay, I can't get this online, so I'm just going to send you a physical one, a PDF. I think that's kind of the root cause of it. But again, that does cause potential issues for their customers or potential customers.
And the other, I suppose, bugbear is mobile forms. You've got such a small area to be able to try and fill something out, and you've got big thumbs and small keypad to be able to do it in. Mobile must be gaining momentum with regard to form filling. Does it represent many challenges?
Certainly, well, I'd say if you're looking at bad form design, mobile is probably the second biggest bugbear after companies building forms for themselves rather than for the customer, which is a sort of broader philosophical issue. But mobile, certainly in terms of implementation, is where we often see the highest volume of issues, because people are not taking into account the mobile experience.
Mm-hmm.
So as you said, classic, the space to tap your fingers is a big issue. How it renders on the form, and I had a particularly horrendous experience last year when I was going abroad and had to fill out one of the vaccine forms for Italy. one of the local regions, and it was just the desktop form replicated on mobile, which is the absolute worst experience if you've got, trying to get a desktop monitor screen into a mobile browser, and you're trying to click into a particular field and then try and even see what you're typing. That's an example of horrendous. It's not even designed because I've not even thought about it, but often, probably at a lesser level, but still frustrating, is the fact that it's not been taken into account how it translates to mobile, how you need to use it, what can users see in the window. I mean, fortunately, a lot of the web building tools now have a lot of that sort of stuff in, so it's getting better, and people, users so businesses are thinking a lot more about it. But certainly mobile is one of the biggest issues in form design we see. You get designers designing the form on a desktop, but not properly testing it on a mobile. Or if they test it on a mobile, they test it on a mobile with a big screen. You need to test it on a mobile phone with the smallest screen possible.
One of my personal bugbears is the fact that if you go and put in a telephone number and it presents you with an alpha or a text keypad.
Yeah, absolutely. Things like that, making sure it's the right keyboard. And phone numbers, it's always a difficult one, even on desktop. It's one of the fields we see get messed up more than any. Businesses are trying to push the customer into putting a phone number in that fits their back end, rather than, the customer might want to put dashes or spaces or brackets or the +44 or not the +44. You see that sort of thing create frustration, unnecessary frustration all over the world.
So one of the points you mentioned earlier was that forms are often built from the company's perspective rather than the user's perspective. How do you manage to overcome that, say, for instance, at a financial institution where there is this conflict between the marketing department, the UX people, and the actual people that want the information? How does your company deal with that?
Well, there's sort of two aspects to it. So there's a kind of the ideal world scenario whereby when you're designing the form or redesigning it, you have a full audit of what you need to achieve, have the customers involved, do various tests, etc., and build from that. And you see the results. That's the best way to get good results. But when you're talking about sort of Zuko, often we come in later on when the form's been designed. Okay, where are the issues? Okay, we can identify the issues. How do we fix them? Well, we can't change that because it's to do with the marketing department. They need it, or it's to do with the regulatory, etc. So when it comes to that, it's obviously more difficult because we don't necessarily have direct access to the marketing people or the compliance people or whoever it may be. So it's working with our point person at the client business to sort of put the point about, we can use some of our benchmarks to show, okay, how we think by removing a particular question might improve overall conversion or whatever it may be. So you basically pull together the evidence and work with your contactor to sell into the business these changes. And sometimes, often where we've been most successful is where there may be a CRO consultant already working with the business, so right. Independent consultants for the form. So we're able to work with them because they may have greater access than we do to sell the improvements, and also they're being paid specifically to do that, so that they're automatically listened to.
So are there any individual areas of forms that companies should pay particular attention to?
Yes, certainly. Well, so there's sort of two levels to this. One is the high level stuff, and then the sort of individual issues that we see come up time and time again. So looking at the high level stuff, there's sort of three categories to look at when you're analysing a form. First one is user issues. So that's frustration with the form itself. So that's just pretty much bad execution of the form. So if you have bad validation or confusing error messages, those sort of things. The second area is the questions that people don't want to answer. So similar to what we've talked about before, but it's an interesting piece if you look at the insurance industry. So with most forms, would say ask for the name and contact details first because it's a nice, easy start and people move into the form. However, you see that completely flipped on its head with insurance. People just want a quote. They don't want to give you their details until they know what the quote is. So that's why, if you're asking with an insurance company, if you see them asking for email address early, then they're probably going to have a much worse conversion than if they asked for it after they'd given a quote. And then the final piece on that area is expectation management. I know you see this a lot in financial services. So if someone doesn't know how long a form's going to take up front, if you're asking for things they don't have to hand, and you've not told them they're going to need, if you ask for someone's passport number halfway through the process and they've got to run off and try and rummage through everything to find the passport, then you've got a bigger chance of losing them. So those sort of three areas that you need to look at when you're looking at your form. When it comes to individual issues, the biggest issues we see are, first one is around the submit button. So people have filled out a form, click submit, and then don't complete. These are people who've spent the time doing it, want to give you their money, and still can't do it. So often what you see is you click the submit button and you get a big sea of red.
Yes.
And it's that sort of issue that, well, it's probably more to do with errors than the submit button itself. But the way to do it is to validate people's answers as they move through, sort of through inline validation. That's one solution we see consistently improve forms conversion rates. There was an external study done a few years ago which showed that it was about 22% improvement on average in conversions if you were to implement an inline validation system. And that's kind of the level we tend to see as well.
Yeah, it's very frustrating, isn't it, when you get to the end and you think, oh, I've put in a 0 instead of a 0.
Yeah, exactly. Tell people early. Not obviously, you don't want to tell them straight away. Like, it's always frustrating when you're typing in your answer and it's telling you it's wrong because you're not finished yet. Come on. But yeah, it's typically as soon as they move from one field to focusing on the next one, that's when you trigger it and say, okay, now hang on a sec. Before you move on, you might want to change this answer.
You mentioned expectation management. Do you think it's a good idea to be able to say, actually, before you complete this form, you will need this, 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 and this, and the average user takes approximately 10, 15 minutes to complete this form? Is that the kind of expectation management you're talking about?
And absolutely, yes. I think it's critical to tell people up front what they're going to need, because otherwise you may well lose them midway through the process. Certainly, if you can give a sort of average time, that is useful to manage expectations. Although you can also do it in more subtle ways. The classic example being a progress bar. So if you have a web form and it has 4 stages, you have those 4 little round boxes at the top. Where you see how you flow through and the sort of information that you're going to need to provide. So you need to provide your personal details, your shipping address, your payment details, and then you're going to need to review and confirm. And that tells people upfront the sort of investment that they're going to need to give to get to the end of your form.
A couple of more questions. The one that I think is on the minds of a lot of marketers is that should a visitor's journey be continued after a form has been submitted? And if so, what's the best practice?
Interesting question. Again, to go back to it depends. Ideally, you may very well want to, but it depends what the user is expecting. What you don't want to do is to be someone's Uber friend and like they filled out a form and go, oh, now you should do this. Now you need to do that.
Yes.
Because a lot of people like, I've done it. I filled the form out. My work here is done.
Yes.
So you might want to build that. It's more about a relationship management piece, which really depends on the product sector and what you're trying to do. Now, if you're in e-commerce, obviously there's a lot more on cross-selling, which you probably would have wanted to do earlier, but you might, then start to cross-sell. If you have different products or different things that people want, it certainly can work quite well as far as we've seen. But then sometimes people don't want to do any more. You've booked your flights through the e-commerce form, and you're like, no, that's it, I'm done. I don't want any more. So it kind of depends. And best way to know is to do tests. Create an experimentation program. What happens if we do this after the form, and compare that to a test and control group.
And one final question, which probably isn't really a question, is are there any other pieces of insight you have that might be useful to others?
Essentially, error handling. If you think of nothing else, think of what your errors are telling people, because that's where what happens when something goes wrong, and that is one of the biggest influences on customer user experience. there's number of tests there that when people see the big red error messages, their cortisol level and stress level goes up. So actually, that is absolutely crucial. So saying avoiding errors, automatically correcting errors if you can, providing useful and helpful error messages at the right time is probably one of the biggest levers you have in improving conversion, particularly of complex forms. So always road test your form. If you're listening to this and you're thinking, is my form any good? Put yourself in the mind of a consumer, go in, put some bad answers into your form, see what the form's telling you. Does it just say, computer says no? Or does it say, oh, well, you've put in this email address, perhaps, you've misspelled Gmail as Gmail or whatever it may be. And so here's a helpful suggestion for you to get the answer correct. So look at your error messages. That's one of the places you'll find the biggest issues on your form.
Alan, thank you very much. It's been a great conversation and some useful tips along the way. And I think you've dispelled a few myths along the way too. It's been good. Hopefully listeners will get some good insights out of this and start to create better forms.
It's been a pleasure, and thanks for having me.